Hello, welcome. I'm Paul Carrigan, here with Stephen Brookfield, the John Ireland Endowed Chair at the University of St. Thomas in Minneapolis, Minnesota, author and co-author of many excellent books on teaching and college teaching, including Teaching for Critical Thinking, Discussion as a Way of Teaching, very recently edited collection Teaching Race, How to Help Students Unmask and Challenge Racism, and the book we're here to talk about today, the discussion book, 50 Great Ways to Get People Talking. Thanks for being here, Stephen.
Oh, you're very welcome, Paul. Thanks for inviting me.
So my first question, you've been interested in discussion and writing about discussion for a long time. What first got you interested in having discussions and in thinking rigorously about how to have them better?
Well, I think the reason I first got interested in this methodology is because it somehow seemed basically democratic and participatory. And my own experience of schooling was one of feeling somewhat diminished or marginalized. I never did very well in school, didn't do well in university. And so when I became a teacher myself, working primarily initially with adults, I was looking for a teaching method which wouldn't leave me or wouldn't leave my students with the same feelings of, being on the periphery that I'd had as a student myself. So I just sort of naturally gravitated towards discussion. But it was interesting because my experiences of participating in discussion as a student were not that great. I felt like it was basically a performance where I was supposed to sound smart and be articulate and project confidently. So discussion groups in college for me were essentially, as I say, a performance. So when I started doing it as my main teaching methodology, I tried to think through, well, how do I avoid that trap? So how do I make discussions amenable and accessible to people who don't feel confident, who are introverted and shy, people for whom English is not the first language, people who feel that their accent or their command of language is not sufficiently academic. How do I bring working class students who aren't white, who are immigrants, into a discussion on an equal basis with those who already are feeling confident? So that's sort of where I began. And I think over the last few decades of my career, I've just become more and more interested in designing protocols that are genuinely participatory, that give everybody a chance to speak, that don't lead to the most confident being automatically the controllers of a discussion, but and stopping a discussion prematurely moving in one particular direction that's set by the most verbose and articulate. So a lot of the exercises in the book that you talk about are informed by that way of thinking. And Steve Preskill and I, who co-authored the book, the 50 techniques that we picked out were ones that we've tried and that I think we can say pretty uniformly, all of them are designed with the aim of getting maximum participation early on from the greatest number of people and stopping those who usually take control from just moving automatically front and center and running the show.
I love that. Well, yeah, there's so much about that answer. I'm surprised to hear that you were not a good student yourself, since you have certainly turned the corner as a scholar. over these decades. But I think that would be really encouraging for a lot of people to hear who aren't good students.
Yeah, well, I can't take tests, Paul. That's my problem. I have throughout my life suffered from depression and anxiety, and one of the ways that anxiety manifests itself is that when I'm in a sort of closed book test taking environment, I freeze, and it doesn't matter how long I've prepared or studied or revised. The anxiety around the act of taking a test just kind of blots everything else out. But if you give me the freedom to set my own pace and to demonstrate to you what I've learned, then I kind of relax and I do a lot better. So in a weird way, I was a much better doctoral student than I was an undergrad or high school student, because in England, at least in doctoral study, it's not like the US. There are no exams. There are actually no courses. Basically, doctoral study is you meet with your advisor every 2 or 3 weeks, talk about where your research is, go away and do some more work, and you kind of build up your thesis, your dissertation over time. So it's like writing a book with an editor, really, and I just found that very congenial. But the whole rigmarole of test taking, you know, I failed to get into university at 18 because I failed a big chunk of my high school leaving tests in England, and when I finally did get into university, I didn't do very well, and so I just have a history of performing badly in examinations. So yeah, it's weird to end up an endowed chair in a university, given that I haven't been a good student. But I do think that not being a good student has prepared me very well for being a teacher, because I naturally empathize with those who struggle to perform well under the conditions of assessment that are typically set by universities and schools. I think I have an empathy for students who struggle, and that's always my starting point. You know, when I'm designing a course, the fact that people are going to struggle to learn. So how do I find a way to ease them into it that feels congenial, and how do I experiment with assessment methodologies that give them a voice and an opportunity to show me what they're learning in a way that feels most congenial to them. And that's become more and more difficult. I mean, I've been teaching since 1970, so that's 49 years. Blimey, it's a long time. So, and I think over those 5 decades, it's become harder and harder to be creative with assessment, because the whole discourse of accountability and the need to set learning outcomes in advance and to determine in advance how students are going to demonstrate that they've learned, which, you know, I think that's a good thing. I'm not against that at all, but it has closed down the opportunity for playfulness. I wrote a book called Engaging Imagination a couple of years ago with a woman called Alison James, and we talked about trying to smuggle in play and creativity into higher education, and how difficult that is sometimes within the working confines of institutions.
Well, one thing I want to ask you about, in your previous book, you and your co-author Stephen Preskill cover just a wide variety of angles on discussion, of what makes a good discussion, what can go wrong, it's a very complex book. It's a long book. It has a lot of facets. And in this book, you seem to zero in on one particular strategy, which is the use of protocols, which you just mentioned a minute ago. So here on page 2, you say, usually when discussion goes bad, It's because there are no protocols or exercises that are used to involve everyone and that use multiple forms of engagement. So I'm curious if you could tell me why, out of all the things you could have focused on, why are protocols so important?
Really, Paul, I think it's because my experience has led me to that conclusion. So in the Discussion as a Way of Teaching book, I think Steve and I say that when we were first teaching way back when, at least I'll speak for myself here, I felt that the longer that I taught, the less reliance I would place on planning and protocols. I felt that I'd just get better at improvising. I would be able to walk into a classroom, sense where students were, ask a couple of good questions, and then just play with the rhythms of the discussion as it evolved. And in fact, the opposite has been the case. I've found that, particularly, I think, as higher education has become more diverse, that when you walk into a room, you have to acknowledge that the students there bring in identities from the outside, bring in self-perceptions and self-images about how capable or not they are as learners. There are strong power differences within a group of students. And so what will happen if I walk into a power-laden, asymmetrical environment where some students are just much more used to speaking than others? What's going to happen if I follow that creative improvisational mode is that those who are already comfortable will be the ones who take up 90% of the space. So I just realized the further I got into my career, I need to be much more intentional about designing discussion methodologies that equalize participation early on. So it's really my experience that has led me to that. It's not at all my inclination. My inclination is actually, I would much rather not have to be that interventionist and not have to be that planful. But it's just that the reality of college classrooms these days means that you really do have to design something that early on stops the usual suspects from taking control. And particularly, you know, I started off in the English equivalent of community colleges, and I still love working with community colleges, although I teach in university and have done for a long time. But when I consult in community college settings, I mean, they're the most open-ended educational environment in certainly in higher education in the United States. So you absolutely have to be very intentional about creating opportunities for everybody to be involved. And I also, when I was doing some research a long time ago, I looked at a lot of experimental and educational psychology studies of group participation and sociometry within groups, and it became clear to me that if you want everybody to participate in a semester, you have to leverage that very early on, because if someone doesn't speak in the first couple of weeks, the chances that they'll speak for the rest of the semester are, you know, fade or fall dramatically. So it's your job, if you feel it's important to hear from everyone, to find channels that allow them to do that. And actually, the whole explosion of social media has been really helpful in that regard. And I now use social media, as I think we talk about in the book, as very deliberate ways of early on in a class bringing everybody's perspective into play. So often with a discussion, I'll start by posing a question to the group, and then I'll say, I don't want you to give me your answer in speech. I want you to post it to, and I often use backchannelchat.com these days. So I say post it to the backchannelchat.com page. And I give them all the link, and I give them 90 seconds to think about a response, and they post their responses. And so, in about 2 to 3 minutes of doing that, I'll have something from maybe 80% of the group. And that's something we can begin the discussion with. And the use of social media for me has been very much driven by this desire to hear from the widest range of people as early as possible.
You just mentioned kind of going outside of the university that you're at and consulting with community colleges, and throughout the book you mention like a wide range of places outside the ivory tower.
Yeah.
On page 27, for instance, it's just this one page. You mentioned that protocol has been used in nonprofits, corporations, hospitals and HMOs, the military, community groups, churches, schools, colleges, and universities.
Yeah.
So I'm interested. That's just fascinating that you're getting out of the university, and I'm wondering, how has your understanding and practice of discussion been challenged or shaped by being out there in the world, so to speak?
Yeah, I love doing that, and so I love going to Quantico to work with the Marines, or Fort Leavenworth to work for the General Army Staff Command College, or consulting with Occupy Wall Street on how to democratize decision making in people's assemblies and so on. I love getting out into these different contexts, and I would say that the interesting thing about it is that actually the dynamics I have to think through are very, very similar across settings. Now, in some settings, let's say like the military, there is a clear hierarchical chain of command. So as I'm going to use discussion there, I have to think through, well, what does that mean if I have in a discussion group people at very different ranks, some of whom have direct command over other members of the group? So then I would say, as I'm introducing an exercise, well, sometimes I think it's important to have the senior person model an open disclosure. So if I'm asking a particularly risky question, let's say around race, and I do a lot of stuff around race these days. So if I'm working with a mostly white group of employees or officers or whatever, I always feel it's a good idea for the most senior person to be the first to respond to a question like, when did you first become aware of your whiteness? Because it's a tough question to answer. So if a senior person answers it first, they're modeling a readiness to engage in a difficult conversation. But in other settings where there's a hierarchy of membership, I'll ask the senior person not to go first. So in particular, let's say if I'm working with a corporation or a hospital and we're trying to understand what are the main problems that are getting in the way of us being effective, then if I pose that question, it would be, let's say, something like, what is the situation you deal with on a daily basis that most drains your energy? If it's that kind of question, then beforehand, I'll say to the, sorry, my cat is needing my attention. I'll say to the, the VP or whoever it is who's at a higher status in the group, please don't be the first to answer the question. Or if we're doing an exercise like, let's say, a circular response exercise where the person who kicks it off has quite an influence on where the conversation will go, I'll usually ask someone of a lower status to be the first person to kick it off. So, you know, those kinds of things come into play when I'm in these different settings. But it's intriguing to me that whether I'm, you know, the protocols that we use in that book have been used in multiple settings, and basically for the same reasons, to keep things relatively democratic early on, you know, to stop prematurely moving to a very familiar way of analyzing a problem, and closing out some intriguing alternative ways. So it's, I guess, actually, all those consulting experiences have been more confirmatory than challenging. They've sort of confirmed my sense that essentially the same kinds of power dynamics replicate themselves in lots of different situations. And so that's the frame you need to go in with, that this is probably going to be a group that contains power imbalances already. And so you need to be planful about stopping those automatically reproducing themselves.
It seems also to confirm if students know, I think sometimes they might think in a class, you know, we're just talking about things. How's this going to help me after college? But to know that these skills are useful in a wide range of contexts.
Yeah, I mean, whenever I introduce a protocol like the 50 in that book, I will always explain to the students why we're doing this particular exercise. So even if it's around a topic, let's say, that has nothing to do with their future career, I would say to them, well, probably when you leave college, you're going to be spending a lot of time in meetings, and meetings are the thing most people dread. So if ever you're in a position to influence how a meeting is run, you might want to think about using a circle of voices or using a chalk talk or whatever it is. So I try and build a case for the utility of these methods in the context they'll be in when they leave college.
I love it. In one of the most useful, I think, moments in the book, when you're introducing the protocol, that's a participation rubric. You say that the most people assume that what good participation in a discussion means talking a lot and sounding smart, and this protocol is aimed at interrupting that definition of good discussion or good participation in discussion.
Yeah.
So what my question is then, if just talking a lot and sounding smart isn't how we're going to define a good discussion, how do you define a good discussion?
I think the first principle is that the participants feel that they have learned something that is relevant or useful to them, or that their horizons have been expanded in some way, they've been introduced to a different way of thinking, or that sometime during the discussion, a question has been posed that's lodged itself into their consciousness and percolates and kind of impels them to move forward into new inquiry or learning. So the first thing that for me would be a good discussion is not having everybody speak for equal amounts of time. I'd focus first on the learning, because I'm using discussion as a way of helping students accomplish certain learning outcomes. I wouldn't use discussion if I want to introduce students to a new difficult topic that needs to be broken down and talked through. I'm fine with giving a mini presentation, or with assigning a piece of reading, or a YouTube video, or whatever. I don't think discussion is appropriate for every learning outcome or endeavor. What it's appropriate to is giving people a sense that there are multiple perspectives possible on particular material or issues, helping them live more or appreciate more the complexity and ambiguity of some topics, taking them deeper and deeper into it, helping them raise new questions. So if that's your intent as a teacher, then I think discussion works really well for you. If your intent is to immerse them in some introductory material, then discussion probably isn't the way to go a lot of the time. Discussion happens after the immersion, when you then want them to question and problematize and go deeper into the introductory material, and you want to kind of complexify it and help them realize that actually, well, we thought we had an understanding of it, but actually we need to go deeper. So that for me would be the kind of the first organizing principle about recognizing a good discussion. And then I would say that in terms of student behaviors, a good discussion has a lot of silence in it, which may seem counterintuitive, but I do believe that silent mulling over, processing, making meaning of ideas as they're being expressed is an important part of discussion. So I'll often I think one of the techniques I talk about there is structured silence. I like every 15 minutes or so to pose a kind of omnibus question, like what's been the most important issue we've raised so far, or what do we need to go deeper into, and tell everybody, no talking, just think about that for a minute, and then we'll hear what your thinking is. So I think it has a lot of silence in it. I think a good discussion, this is basically very much attached to the participation rubric that you just mentioned, Paul. I think a good discussion has students asking questions a lot of each other. And I think it has students or participants, because this is as true of a staff development effort in a hospital as it would be as a higher ed classroom. The participants, the members, will be drawing each other out, will be responding to and building on each other's contributions. So listening and responding really are sort of the behaviors that I'm looking for as the chief markers of a good discussion. Of course, you have to have people who are introducing new ideas and bringing new perspectives as well. But the rubric is very much written to let people know that it's the listening and responding that's really the important part of discussion. And that's a really tough thing to get across, I often find, because this idea of participation being confidently articulate and verbose, is very, very deeply rooted in the kind of performance discourse of higher ed. So I have that rubric in my syllabi. I talk a lot about it. The assessment tool that I've developed is based on that rubric, we didn't include that in the book. That's happened since the book was published, but you can find it on my website, which is stephenbrookfield.com. I put all my materials up there for free download, so you don't need to contact me to get permission to use anything you find there. stephenbrookfield.com. I think teachers learn by stealing. That's how I learn. That's how I got better. By stealing things that I saw other people do and think, hey, that's a great idea. I can, experiment with that. And I try it out, and then I adapt it a little bit. And then I go to a conference and see someone doing something else. And I'm just constantly looking for ideas to steal with attribution, though. I always try and say where I got them from.
You mentioned that a good discussion needs at least some people introducing new perspectives or ideas, and I run into a problem sometimes. And maybe it's even refreshing in a culture that is debate driven, but the entirely agreeable conversation in which we all kind of share the same view and pat each other on the back, and nothing new gets considered. So I've conceived of a protocol or a rule that I wanted to run by you and see what you thought about it. And maybe it's already similar to your devil's advocate or dissenter role in one of your protocols.
Right. Yeah.
But so the idea would be that you would have a rule that before the conversation ends, someone has to air a contrary view to what's being said. And even if it's not their view, they could say something like, I agree with what's being said, but someone who disagrees might say.
Yeah.
Just to make sure that alternative perspectives are part of the conversation. What do you think about someone like that?
Yeah, I like that. I think that's very important, because otherwise you get into this groupthink mode. And I notice also when I ask students to do peer evaluation, all they do is give favorable evaluations of each other. It seems like there's, committing a sin if they say something critical. So I do think, yeah, before the end of the discussion, I would like someone, as you say, to pose a dissenting view, and they can acknowledge that it's not their own, but so-and-so might say. And one of the things, I do something like this sometimes. I will ask students to speak in the voice of critic A or critic B. So I'll say, I want you to do a mental projection here. Put yourself in the mind of this person, this perspective, this different viewpoint, and give us the sense of how someone who held that viewpoint would respond. And I think what you're doing, is giving students the permission to play with ideas, but not requiring them to identify as the originator of those ideas. And that's really important. There's a little technique I think we include in there called methodological belief, which we stole from Peter Elbow. And methodological belief is that you present a contrary view to the group, and you say, we're just going to have 5 minutes out of the hour we have, let's say, for class. In this 5 minutes, I want us to look at the topic or at this work we're studying only through this particular dissenting lens. For 5 minutes, please believe that this dissenting lens that you probably don't agree with is actually the truth and is actually accurate. So if you believe that, what would it mean for your understanding of this topic or of this material? So it's the same thing. You give them a 5-minute play period, and for 5 minutes, they're asked to believe something very different from their normal way of thinking. And it's I think it's your way and other ways, and it's good good techniques to free people up mentally to play that little game. And there's something about giving them labeling it as a game. That means it's less threatening. So yeah, I'm a big believer in the strategy you're talking about, Paul. That's great.
My next question is almost kind of from the opposite end. So in the final protocol in the book on 244, you describe a strategy where the facilitator or the teacher does some summing up at the end, including correcting any misstatements or errors or omissions or misunderstandings that have come up, so as to not have to call them out during the conversation. But then you also say that sometimes people are so far off the mark that you have to intervene. And so I'm wondering if you can give me some advice for how to respond in the moment when somebody says something that, I guess from the perspective of the facilitator, is definitely wrong or even hurtful, especially when that comment is rooted not just in a misunderstanding, but like in a political commitment So what do you do when someone says something racist or sexist or homophobic in the flow of the conversation?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, but unfortunately, I have to go.
Oh,
Just kidding. No, I think
oh,
it's a really, really tough question. And like most tough questions, it's very much a judgment call, and there isn't a kind of one rule that applies for everything. But some of the things that I would try when that happens, the first would be, if I know it's going to be a contentious topic, which something like race is very raw and can be very hurtful to people, then I would have made sure that I work with the group to set clear ground rules early on. And so then I would invoke whatever ground rule. So let's say, one of the ground rules is that we refrain from, we can criticize another person's views, but we can't criticize their personhood, which is a hard idea for some students to get their head around. So I say, you can criticize the view, but not the person. So separate the view from the person. I try and give some examples of what that would look like. So that's one approach to it. A second approach is when someone makes an outrageous statement that's clearly factually wrong, then I say, well, now I'm going to play the role of evidential assessor. An evidential assessor is something that's I'll sometimes assign to different students or different members of a group. And the evidential assessor has the responsibility of making sure that people don't make generalizations without some supporting data. So I'll say, okay, what is the evidence that you have for this view? I'd be interested in knowing, what data lie behind it. And if the person says, well, I heard it from a friend, or it's just my experience, or it's my experience that, or I know someone who, then that gives me a chance to say, well, in a kind of academic setting, we need to have higher standards for claims that we're making than just someone told me. And basically, any scholar who's making a claim needs to be able to present evidence to a third party that justifies the claim that they've made. So, I mean, this is something that I try and advise people to do in freshman orientation seminars. What makes high school different from college? Well, what the identity of a college student means that at a very basic level, you have to give reasons and evidence for the making of claims. That's basically what academics is about. So that would be a second thing that I would do. And then a third approach is if someone says something that's really, I think, is potentially hurtful, but no one responds, and let's say it's particularly going from a white student to the students of color who are in the class, or it's making generalizations that are pretty racist about people of color, then I would stop, I'd intervene, and I'd say several things. One would be, there was a time in my life when I held that view, and I'd use myself as an example, because I'm trying not to shut the student down completely, because everyone has a right to express how they're thinking. That's what you're trying to do, to get at students' expressions of thinking. But sometimes I'll just say, that was a viewpoint that I've held, or I have others in my family who hold that, and what I always say to them is such and such. So I might do that. Or another approach is to say, in my experience, what you've just said, and you may not realize this, can be experienced as very hurtful by somebody else. And so I'd just like to stop your comment here and check in with other members of the group to see if they're having a reaction like that. And I'll say, because if you say something particularly that's you believe to be true, but that it's not intended to hurt anyone, you can say those things without ever realizing the effect that you're having. So part of being a college student and part of being an adult and moving out into the world is realizing that the messages you send out to people aren't always received in the way that you think they are. So I just want to pause and give other people a chance just to sit with that comment for a moment. And then I want to check in and see if anyone has a negative reaction or found it to be hurtful. So depending, I don't know, I've listed 4 or 5 different responses. Depending on the situation, I would use one of them. One thing that I know in my bones from students of color is that if you as an instructor don't intervene when something like that is articulated, then you've lost their trust, and it's very hard to get it back. So even though, for me as a white person, I'm not used to talking about race because I've grown up thinking that I don't have a race. That's part of what being white means. But I just have to remember that from the student's viewpoint, and I'm supposed to be there as a kind of authoritative ally for students to help them learn. From a student of color's viewpoint, if I don't step in and interrupt at that moment, then I've just lost a really good opportunity to build some trust between myself and students of color, and for them to feel like this is a space in which we won't just automatically replicate the usual racist stuff. It's very hard to do. And actually, one of the things that, if I were ever put in control of higher education in this country, what I would say is that as much as possible, every course should be team taught by a white person and a person of color, so that in the moment when these things happen, the team can check in with each other and model that kind of communication, and then check in with the group. But since I'm never likely to be in charge of higher education in this country, that's a bit of a pipe dream. But that team teaching is my go-to model. Whenever I've been involved in program design, which I have designed some major programs from scratch in my life, I always start off with team teaching. That's the de facto pedagogy is team teaching, because students need to see models of teachers talking to each other and critiquing each other and checking in with each other. And one of the problems with discussion that Steve and I mentioned this in the Discussion as a Way of Teaching book, Steve Preskel and I, is that students, you usually run a discussion solo. It's you as the instructor, and then you're telling the students to have a discussion, but they never see you modeling discussion behaviors in front of them. So if I'm running a discussion-based course, I really try in the first or second week, even if I'm just teaching solo, to bring in a colleague as a kind of guest, or a couple of colleagues, and for a while we model what a discussion looks like. And what we're doing in that modeling, as I say, is asking questions, building on each other's contributions, expressing appreciation from a different viewpoint we never thought about before, disagreeing with each other, but in a way that doesn't demean the person, as you're registering a disagreement with a particular viewpoint and questioning theory or data behind it. So, that to me, that's a fundamental contradiction in a lot of discussion-based teaching. The students don't see us modeling what we're asking them to do. And I've always felt as a mantra, as a teacher, you have to strive to model whatever it is you want students to do, right up front at the beginning. You have to kick off doing that, basically to give them a sense of what you want them to do, but also to earn the right to then ask them to do the things, excuse me, that you've just done.
I love so much about your answer. Thank you. I have just one or two more things to ask you. One is that when I read this book, I think, phew, this sounds doable. I can do this. Discussion is simple. And then when I read discussion as a way of teaching, I think, whew, this is hard. I don't know if I can do all
Right.
this.
Yeah.
And I think I'm reading both books correctly.
Yeah.
The one means to complicate discussion, and the other means to simplify it. And I think teachers ought to read both of these books. That would be my recommendation. But I get the impression that this book is meant to be, if you're going to have one resource, take this and you can use it. And I wonder if you just, what do you think the trade-offs of simplifying, what is gained, what is lost by leaving so much out?
Yeah, I think with the recent book, the kind of top 50 techniques to get people to talk, one of the dangers of that, as you rightfully point out, is that it does maybe imply to a reader that this is simple. All I need to do is take this protocol and run with it. Whereas the discussion as a way of teaching book talks about all the contradictions involved in discussion, emphasizes the unpredictability of it, the fact that you can have a protocol, but then what actually happens when you get into the kind of meat and potatoes of it is it can just go any to be good at thinking in the moment and improvising and dealing with tough decisions, making all those micro decisions where you can't go away and think about it for 10 minutes because you've got to respond within 5 seconds to a comment that a student makes. So that is a problem of a book just of techniques. But on the other hand, we just felt this will be really helpful to people to have a kind of pocket-sized book they can stuff into a purse or to an overcoat pocket, and all it is different techniques to try out. And my feedback from readers over the years and from workshops that I've done has been overwhelmingly that people want those very specific, applicable, direct techniques. So I thought, there is a case just for some pulling those all together and just publishing that book. And it's meant to be portable. We sort of had to convince the publishers because they don't publish in the small format that book is published in. They usually do much bigger hardbacks or paperbacks, traditional sized. So we said, no, this is like a kind of resource manual. You just stuff at the last minute as you're, catching the bus or taking the subway or whatever to a meeting. And you can quickly flick through it and get a couple of ideas about how you might run the meeting or run the training that you're tasked with doing or whatever. But I absolutely take your point that the disadvantage of that is that it does underplay the complexity and unpredictability of this thing called discussion.
Well, I have so enjoyed talking with you about this book. Thank you. My last question is just, is there anything else you'd like to say that I haven't asked you about?
I think that I would maybe just say that I feel as a teacher that I'm getting better at doing this, but that I still make a lot of mistakes in using discussions. And the more I try out different protocols, the more I refine them, and the more I realize that something that seems straightforward, let's say, I think the first one in the book we talk about is a little technique called circle of voices, a small group conversation to make sure that everybody is heard from at the beginning, and then so it's structured so that people are required to listen very carefully and respond to what others have said, you know, the basics of good discussion. So we've tried that in multiple settings, and although I think the bones, the basic anatomy of that technique is good, I do have to sort of mold it and just kind of twist it in different directions depending on the context that I'm working in. And sometimes it works better, sometimes it doesn't. A lot depends on the way that I introduce it. A lot depends on the timing of it. So I feel like, you know, I will go to my grave trying to still ponder work these things out, you know, and improve. So, you know, I think like most teachers, we're just learning all the time. And I'm, as I said earlier, I'm always looking to steal from colleagues and from books or videos. So you know, I never regard myself as a fully formed discussion leader, although I'm often asked to do workshops on this, and I feel I have something useful to say. That doesn't mean that I'm a kind of fully formed expert on it. I'm just as much on a quest as any other teacher is.
Well, you, as you said earlier, you've only been doing this for 49 years, so maybe you'll get it right next year.
Maybe the 50th year will be the charm.
Well, Stephen, this has been delightful, and I'm learning so much from you. I thank you for your books and for your time.
Okay, thanks very much, Paul. It's been a great conversation.
All right, so long.